So the time of, oh, sorry, yes, children's church. Yeah. Thanks, Charlotte. I can count on you. So, the time of Judges was a rough one on Israel. Over and over again, they drifted away from God and chased after these foreign idols. Then they would start getting desperate and they would cry out to God. He would raise up a leader to protect them. That leader, a strong personality would keep things together. And then when that person died, it would just start all over again. And they were just harassed on every side by these foreign nations that they had not driven out as God commanded. And so today we're starting a new phase of the story. So they had their 400 years of slavery in Egypt, then that kind of interlude of wandering in the desert and then conquering, and then roughly 400 years during the time of the Judges. And so our new chapter opens with the birth of Samuel. And so we've got, Hannah and her great petition and the beginning of Samuel's relationship with God. And this was a really, really big deal during the entire book of Judges. This is, again, roughly 400 years of time. There's only 2 prophets mentioned. Deborah was one of them, and how nice that the leader of the nation was also the prophet. That probably cleared up some communication issues. And then there was one that didn't even get his name in the story right when Gideon was coming on the scene. That's not many prophets for 400 years. And so here we have in Samuel a good, solid spiritual leadership. But we tend to refer to the nation of Israel when we talk about these people in this phase, but they weren't really a nation yet. That's where the story of Saul comes in. This is kind of a transition, a pivot point between whatever it was beforehand and them becoming a nation, because they had invaded the promised land. They had claimed territory. Then each tribe went to their area, but they were just a bunch of tribes living in very, very spread out areas. And they were continuously threatened by the Philistines, the Midianites, the Amorites, the Amalekites, the Canaanites, and the ones that were the hardest to get rid of, the Cellulites. Did you? I got that joke from Max Lucado himself. I was like, how did I never think of that one? The Cellulites, they just won't go away. So the Hebrew people, we've talked about this. They were kind of outmanned and outgunned, if you will, from the very beginning. They weren't a military society. They had been slaves or desert wanderers. They didn't really have, the generations of military training going for them. But at this point in the story, they've been settled for a little while, and they had been battling. So they weren't a bunch of, desert wanderers with pitchforks anymore, but still the nations around them were better organized. They were more military minded, so they had better military leadership. They had better weapons, better tactics, everything going for them. And the Philistines, they were just a constant problem. They had developed iron weapons. So again, this was, that was like being the first one to invent the bow and arrow. It was a huge tactical advantage for them. And plus, I had missed this. It didn't come up in my Sunday school class when I was 10. The Philistines had systematically tried to eradicate the blacksmiths from amongst the Israelites, to the point that they didn't have the right weapons. And if they wanted to take one of their farming implements and get it sharpened, they had to pay a Philistine to get it sharpened. There's one story. There's one. It's kind of tucked away in there where they're getting ready to start a battle, and Saul realizes he and Jonathan are the only ones with swords, and everybody else has some kind of farming tool that they've sharpened up. Yeah, that's not how you want to start a battle, is it? Anyway, the people felt like sitting ducks. They just felt like everybody else is stronger than us. Everybody else has a king and great military leaders. We need to be like them. And they made the mistake that so many God followers have made over the centuries. And they said, well, everyone else has a king. We should be like them. Maybe that. will help. And so here's where things start going wrong. This is 1 Samuel chapter 8. Samuel grew old, and he appointed his sons as judges for Israel. Little j. They weren't the kinds of judges that God had raised up. And his sons turned aside after dishonest gain, accepted bribes, and perverted justice. Which is really ironic because Samuel took over because Eli, the priest that raised Samuel, his sons did that kind of stuff, and God said this has to end. So somehow Samuel did not learn important lessons from his mentor. And so the people were like, well, this isn't going to work. You know, there has to be succession. You did fine, but now it's a new day, and your sons are a complete waste of space. And so the elders of all Israel gathered together, and they said, you're old, your sons don't walk in your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have. Ooh, now Samuel took that a little personally, probably. Don't blame him entirely. But I think that hurt him. You know, and God said, listen to them, but warn them, right? And and so he went back and he said, this is what a king will do. He'll take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses. He'll assign some to be commanders of thousands and fifties, and some he'll assign to plow his ground and reap his harvest. Others he'll assign to make weapons of war and equipment for him. He'll take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He'll take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants, and on and on and on. And, you're not thinking about what you're asking for. Kings come at a cost in some. But the people said, no, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations. With a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles. Oh, man. I mean, this is hard. And again, I'm surprised Samuel did not completely lose it at that point and kind of go Jerry Springer on him. But here, this is what contextually is easy to miss if you just start in chapter 8, which I did. This was coming on the heels of some spectacular stuff where the people had turned to the Lord, and Samuel had encouraged them to get rid of their Ashtoreths and their Baals and serve God, and the people were coming around. This is in chapter 7, verse 10. And they were in the middle of a sacrifice. Samuel was sacrificing the burnt offering, and the Philistines attacked, and God threw them into such a panic that they were routed. I mean, it's like, okay, we're going to pause the church service and go kick some butt out there. I mean, it was the middle of a worship service, and the Philistines attacked, and God still made it a massive victory for Israel. And that is when Samuel put up the Ebenezer stone, the one we sing that song about. He put up the stone and said, God has brought us so far. Look at this. He brought us victory over the Philistines. And while Samuel was alive, the Lord's hand was against the Philistines. They had had such success. With who leading their army exactly? With who fighting for them? And then, see, that makes it worse. That makes it way worse. And then and granted, Samuel's sons, that was bad. But all of a sudden, they can't remember God fighting for them. And these were people who had heard the stories of armies being outmatched and winning because a hailstorm destroyed most of the other team, or they would get confused and attack each other, or hornets. I mean, God did most of the fighting for them. And somehow they're like, we really need a king to fight for us. So that was a problem all by itself. But we want to be like other nations. And I just feel like that had to grieve the heart of God. It had to. I mean, we're called to be a holy people, right? We are called to be set apart. And we're supposed to be different as worshipers and followers of God. And if we're looking around going, well, gosh, we want to be like them, something is terribly wrong. That is a failure on the part of the church. And I could not even begin to count the number of times the church throughout the centuries has undermined its own mission because of this kind of thinking. Well, everybody else does this. Anyway, so then in chapter 9, we meet Saul. And you can just picture the camera panning across a crowd and then coming back to Saul. He was a head taller than everybody else and one of the best looking guys in the country. You know, he was always on the list of people's most eligible bachelors. His dad was a man of standing, not necessarily fabulously wealthy, but he was known. Saul, as a young man, was a donkey herder. Herding is a kind of good king work, apparently. It wasn't glamorous, but, he lost he lost the donkeys he was in charge of. That should have been a warning sign. Anyway, he's looking for these donkeys. He's like, let's stop. I heard there's this guy who can kind of tell the future and stuff. They called him the seer. Let's go ask him if he knows where my donkeys are. And it just so happened that God had said, I'm going to show you the one. And when Samuel caught sight of Saul, the Lord said to him, this is the man I spoke to you about. He will govern my people. And Samuel's like, the one who lost his donkeys, that one? Yeah, just checking. That's not in there. I made that up. And Samuel says to him, go up ahead of me to the high place. Today you are to eat with me. In the morning I will send you on your way and tell you all that is in your heart. As for the donkeys you lost 3 days ago, don't worry about them. They've been found. And to whom is all the desire of Israel turned, if not to you and your whole family line? And Saul answered, but am I not a Benjamite, the smallest tribe of Israel? Isn't my clan the least of the clans of the tribes of Benjamin? Why would you say that to me? These weren't quite Moses-level arguments, but just like Moses or Gideon and others, he just wasn't sure he had the right resume. He didn't understand why Samuel would be saying this to him. And, Samuel says, I'm going to tell you everything on your heart. He was establishing for this person who didn't know him well that God really did speak through him. And so they dined together, and then Samuel gives Saul all these directions. You're going to go here. It was a little like when Jesus told his disciples, you're going to go here, and you're going to find this donkey. You're going to say this. It was like that. You're going to meet these people. This is going to happen. Then you're going to go here, and you're going to meet these people, and this is going to happen. Really specific. And then the third thing, he said, after that, you'll meet a procession of prophets coming down from the high place with lyres, timbrels, pipes, and harps being played before them, and they will be prophesying. The Spirit of the Lord will come powerfully upon you, and you will prophesy with them, and you will be changed into a different person. Anybody had that happen at a job interview? Saul had to be wondering what this all was. But it literally happened that way. He sees this group of people. He joins in. And people who knew him were looking at each other going, is that Saul? Is that the Saul that I know? The donkey loser? That guy? He was completely different. And listen, sometimes, because I remember vividly all the stories from my childhood Sunday school of where Saul was an awful, nasty person and he tried to kill David. That seemed to come up all the time. I don't know. Maybe my teacher had a thing about that. And I think I've tended to think of him as just someone who was flawed from the beginning. And I'm not sure that's true, because here's what happens. So Samuel, the prophet, has said, you're it. God's picked you. You're going to be changed. You're going to be different. And he felt the Spirit come upon him. And then everybody gathers. This is a separate thing. So the whole nation gathers. And Samuel's like, all right, God's going to pick our next king. And they did the casting lots. And it fell to Benjamin. Oh, okay. Ooh. Then it fell to his clan. And then then the lot fell to this guy Saul. And it's like the drum roll starts, the spotlight goes on, and they can't find him. And then, if not for God's intervention, that would have been the end of the whole ceremony. But God says to him, he's hiding with the supplies. Is that a super cocky guy like, yeah, I got this, I deserve to be king? It's not. It's a guy who's thinking, what have I signed up for? A guy who's a little overwhelmed, as he should be. He's hiding with the supplies. So they drag him out there. And it's a little weird. The narrative here is a little confusing because they drag him out and they coronate him, crown him, whatever. And some of the people are like, I don't know, this guy, we know his dad, you know. We know all he does is herd donkeys. So there were some people who were just like, I don't think he can do it. We're not so sure about this guy. And then next thing you know, like the next story, Saul is coming in from the field from plowing behind his oxen. So I don't think this king thing has taken yet. I'm just telling you, that's what I'm seeing here. Something hasn't quite clicked yet if he's out plowing his own field and not telling somebody else to do it. But he hears about a Hebrew city being threatened. And in our video this morning, he made a big deal. This was these enemies said to the people of Israel, you can live near us in peace as long as all the men let us gouge their right eye out. Because then you have no depth perception and you're not very dangerous. And Saul just went nuts. And so he calls all the people together. He says, we are doing something about this. It actually says, the Spirit of God came powerfully upon him, and he burned with anger. This was really reminiscent of how the scriptures speak about Samson, when the Spirit of the Lord would come upon him, and he would slay 1,000 people by himself. And true to form, Saul leads the army to this smashing victory. And all of a sudden, everybody's on board. Boy, being a winner will do that, won't it? And in fact, they're getting together and they're like, who are those guys who said he shouldn't be king? Because we're going to kill them right now because they're bad people. And Saul's like, easy now. Let's not kill anybody. We're all on the same team here. Sometimes people need convincing, I guess. I know there's some of you who are still like, are we sure about this guy? Are you sure he's a preacher? He doesn't act like a preacher. Anyway, I understand that, and it's okay. But Saul had it made from that point. That seems to be, and they got together and they said renewed, but I think that's really when he became king. After he showed them that he had what they really wanted, and that's some military leadership. He proved himself, and then he was for real. And then it looks like, if you're just kind of reading through, it looks like he's crowned the king, and next thing you know, he's making terrible errors. But some time had to pass. His son Jonathan is in the army now. He wasn't even married before. So things have happened. Time has passed. He's the king now. He's used to being the king. The system has been built up. Can you imagine starting that organization and having to build up all of the trappings? That makes my head spin. We don't even meet his wife and find out about the children until a couple chapters later. But here's what happens. Here's what happens. Saul got too busy being king to mess around with worship. He got too concerned about his military timetables to be concerned with what God told him to do. He got too worried about enemies and troops and formations and his numbers and all that kind of stuff, and lost sight of who really did the fighting when Israel marched out to battle. He got, in sum, too big for his britches. Do people still say that, or is that going to die with people my age? I hope we hold on to that. It's a great phrase, even though no one knows what a britch is anymore. You can only have plural, so it's only if there's more than one. Nobody says britches anymore. I guess among the decent people, no one says that anymore. They say it in my family. That was being difficult. You just hate for good sayings to die out just because they don't make any sense anymore. Yes, your britches are going to get tanned with a switch. You know what a switch is? I'll pick my own. That's the rule, right? So there's this whole thing, where Samuel just said, wait until I'm there. That's the only rule you have to worry about. Just wait till I'm there. We'll do our sacrifices, and then I'll send you out. Period. Simplest possible. Yeah. Coach, you ever give your team a really simple instruction? You ever see them act like you didn't explain anything to them? Yeah. This is people, but he's watching his army get antsy, and he's watching the enemy get organized, and he's like, I can't wait. I'm going to lose if I wait to do what Samuel said. And so he kicks up the timetable, takes care of everything, runs with it. And he says, I had to seek the Lord's favor because it was time to go to battle. But what he wanted was to move ahead with his plan and for God to kind of rubber stamp it on the way. And Samuel says, what have you done? What have you done? With that one choice. And this does seem a little precipitous, but we're assuming that there were other things involved. He has ensured that his kingship will not pass to his child and grandchild and so on throughout the generations. You would think this experience would really get his attention. That seems like a memorable thing that you're just like, I'm not letting that happen again. Because we've all had experiences where we realized we had really messed up. And usually we're just like, okay, I got to break this down. I got to think about where I went wrong and not ever do that again, right? Especially if you made your spouse angry. Never, ever again. She can't even think of anything that I could be talking about. Nobody's allowed to talk to her after church. But somehow, even if he did think about it then, even if it was serious to him at the time, it just didn't stick. And maybe because things kind of went back to normal. You know, God still communicated. There was still success. Saul still had victories. Maybe he just thought, oh, you know, things are good. Maybe he let it go. Maybe he didn't really mean it. He was angry. And then the big event of this story arc happens, where God says, you know, go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Got to clarify. So when they talk about this wasn't what we think of as just scorched earth stuff. This was a traditional thing. It goes way back in their history of warfare. That you are not just destroying stuff, you are devoting those things to God. This is entirely for God, and I will not get any use out of it. So even though it seems like just warfare, there was sort of a worshipful element to that. But he was asking for this. You know, everything is devoted to me. And so Saul calls his huge army together. They use all these clever tactics. They win. But, verse 9, this is chapter 15. But Saul and the army spared Agag, the king, and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves, the lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak, they totally destroyed. Let me paraphrase. Everything that was useless and worthless, they happily devoted to the Lord. The good stuff, they were not willing to devote to the Lord. See, it makes more sense when you read it that way, and that's really what it meant. Could have been greed. Could have been just pure disobedience. Could have been low faith. Hey, why would we kill all these good animals when this can ensure that we'll have plenty of food? We don't know. I mean, probably all of us have had those thoughts, you know, gosh, I could sure use my time for something else. I really need that money for something else. Whatever our resources are, we do have those thoughts that maybe God doesn't need those. Maybe I don't need to devote those to God. Maybe I need them more. We've all had that thought. Totally human. And poor Samuel. I mean, this guy's been retired for a while now. And the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I have made Saul king because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. And Samuel was angry, and he spent all night crying out to the Lord. I mean, he was invested in this guy. He was. He's angry at Saul. He's upset for his nation. And so the next morning he gets up and he's hurrying out to see how they've gone off the rails. and when he meets some people, they're like, oh, Saul, he went over there to set up the monument to himself. Story told, right? At that point, you know exactly what is going on. Because when people say, I need a monument to myself, their head is not in the right place. There's just no way it can be. So he's got this big monument to himself, and he's gathered the king and all of this great, livestock. Maybe he was kind of planning on keeping it for himself. Maybe he wanted to do a huge sacrifice in front of the cheering crowds to show them what a great king he was. We don't really know. But Samuel's coming up, and Saul comes running out. You might be picturing one of your children. We were picturing one of ours. I did exactly what God said. And Samuel's like, really? Really? I can think of 20 different times I've had this conversation with Brett. He's like, I did everything you said. And I was like, why can I see dirty dishes from here? Right? Okay. Maybe it's just our family. And Saul's just like, I did everything. And Samuel says, I hear the sheep and cows. I can hear them from here, but it's not like, oh, oops, there's no sign that he didn't intend for Samuel to ever know. That's why I wish we just knew what he was thinking. But he kind of doubles down. He's like, listen, no, I'm serious. We did exactly what God said. We went in and destroyed the bad stuff and kept all the good stuff. But we're gonna dedicate it to the Lord your God. Did anybody else catch that? To the Lord your God. Ooh. Freudian slip, perhaps, Saul? Yeah. This was all about him. Maybe he and the guys were going to take some of it home. Maybe they really did intend for a big show. Because you think there were other kings who were like, I'm sacrificing 10,000 animals to show what a king I am. That was a thing. So that could have been what he was aiming for. And Samuel says, man, you were a great king when you were still small in your own eyes. That's when things worked. You thought you were nothing and God raised you up. Now, oh man. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice. Rebellion like divination, arrogance like idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. Folks, may we never, ever try to replace obedience with anything. There is nothing holy and churchy enough to replace obedience to God. You can have perfect worship attendance for 50, 60 years. You can sing extra loud at every song. You can wear the nicest outfits anybody's ever seen. You can put gigantic bills into the offering plate in wads big enough to make it dip when you drop them in. And it won't replace obeying the Lord. You following me? All the things that we think, well, this is being godly, this is being holy. Obedience. Obedience. And I'm telling you, Saul did not like the terms that Samuel was using, but it is rebellion when we decide to put ourselves where God's supposed to be. When we decide something about our opinion is more important than God's, that's worshiping ourselves. That is rebellion. That is idolatry. And it should scare us a little. It should be unsettling that Saul honestly believed he was obeying everything while he rejected the word of the Lord. That makes me nervous. And I think that is one of the many reasons we need each other so badly. We've got to have people around us who are willing to speak the truth in love to us and will give us a nudge when we start drifting. We've got to have that, because when you're in a position where everybody is a yes man around you, when everybody kowtows and says, whatever you say, boss, you're setting yourself up for drifting, and nobody's going to say to the king, gosh, are you sure this is a good idea? Nobody says that to the king. We need that from each other. We need the accountability of Christian fellowship. We need that. And there's a lot more to the story, goodness gracious. And we can see when David comes onto the scene that Saul remembers that he's been rejected as king. You can see it in his paranoia and the way he reacts to things. But here's the irony that really jumped out at me from this whole story. This is the one time, and I cannot think of another. If you can think of one, tell me, I want to know. The only time that we've seen where God picked the likely candidate. The one a head taller than everybody else, the best looking guy in the crowd, the one that people would look at and say, now that's a king. Isn't that weird? Because God has this great track record of picking people that you would never pick out of a crowd. And this time, we don't know why. This time he picks the one that looks the part. But it only worked while he was small and insignificant in his own eyes. That's our struggle there. We have to always keep ourselves in perspective. And I think we work at this as a church. I think we do. But it's always a danger. So we need to know, even though we're an amazing church, that's not because we're special. It's because God's special. Even though we accomplish incredible things for a tiny little church off the beaten path, that's not us. That's God. As long as we keep that in perspective, we won't start strutting around like, yeah, I can do that because, I have a church that's better than everybody else's. But you guys, so I'm at the state Baptist meeting just like you, sorry people, think you have a good church. But I know it's not because of me. If it had to do with me, it would all be a mess. I know it's because God's at work and because you have let God lead us and bind us and move us. And because we are able to get on board with God's will. And as long as we remember that this is God's work, we're going to be okay. It's when we only start being big in our own eyes when we think it's about us. So it's not really having money. It's not having power. It's not being a person of influence. It's not accomplishments. It's not winning battles. It's all in here. It's all in keeping ourselves in the right place and keeping God where he's supposed to be. If we can do that, then we can be as successful as we want. We just going with the role that God is on. The guy who hid from his own coronation, that's the kind of person that God can use. The one who builds a monument to himself, that's the kind God's like, I got to move on. Time for me to find somebody after my own heart. Saul would have been so much better off if he had been a nobody from nowhere with nothing to his credit but faith in God, right? That's the kind of resume we all want to have. We're going to close with our hymn of commitment. It's number 318, A Nail-Scarred Hand. I'll be standing down front. If there's anything that God has put on your heart that you'd like to share with me, anything you'd like prayer over, I hope you'll come and talk to me. Let's stand and sing. Well, we did. This was something that came up during Sunday school. We always end up focusing on all the things that go wrong and trying to think, how do we avoid that problem? But just remember that Saul got it right when he thought, I'm not the kind of guy who can do this. And when he started thinking he needed monuments to himself, that was when he had lost the ability to be the leader that Israel needed. So let's just remember, we can emulate the good part. We can try to remember, hey, we don't have anything to offer but obedience. And that's all God needs. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.